The night air was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that makes you feel like someone is watching from the dark. Out there, tucked behind the folds of America's forgotten back roads, there was a house no one dared to approach. The windows were clouded with grime, the roof sagged under decades of neglect, and the soil around it carried a smell no one could ever quite name. People whispered about what lived inside, but they never said it too loud. For years, the story of the most inbred couple ever found in America was hidden beneath dust, silence, and shame. But every secret has a way of crawling back into the light, no matter how hard the town tries to bury it. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. It began with an investigator, an ordinary man who stumbled onto something extraordinary. He was sent to document abandoned homes across rural Appalachia to capture the dying heartbeat of towns that had been forgotten by the rest of the country. When he entered that crumbling house, he thought he'd find nothing more than old photographs, peeling wallpaper, and broken bottles. Instead, he uncovered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. On the floor of a room that smelled of damp wood and decay, there were photographs, handwritten notes, scraps of memories bound together with string. Faces stared back from those images, but they weren't like the faces you'd expect. Eyes sat too far apart, jaws crooked downward, skin pale and blotched like candle wax left too close to the flame. And in every picture, always together, was a man and a woman, lovers, partners, a couple in every sense, but they weren't supposed to be. Their resemblance was too close, their lineage too tangled. And the deeper he looked, the more he realized that what he found wasn't just a story of poverty or isolation or neglect. It was a story of bloodlines looping in on themselves. The couple lived in plain sight, and yet they didn't. Their neighbors whispered, the church avoided them, and the town carried their existence like a wound no one wanted to touch. But their story didn't vanish. It waited. It waited for someone to open that door, pick up those photographs, and realize that they had stumbled upon the most inbred couple America had ever hidden away. The photographs were only the beginning. As the investigator sifted through the yellowing images and brittle letters, a picture began to emerge, one that no local ever dared to put into words. The couple had grown up just a few miles apart, yet their family trees were so deeply entwined it was nearly impossible to trace where one branch ended and another began. Brother to cousin, cousin to sister, uncle to niece. The lines blurred until blood itself seemed confused. And at the heart of it, these two individuals had been pushed together not by love, not by chance, but by a cycle of isolation that had been repeating for generations. The town was small, cut off by mountains and dirt roads that washed out with every storm. Outsiders rarely came, and those who did never stayed. Work was scarce, poverty was deep, and family was the only thing that survived. In such places, the world shrinks. Marriages aren't chosen from possibility, but from proximity. When there are no new faces, the old ones become the only choice. That was the world this couple had been born into, a closed circle with no escape. But even within that circle, something about them stood out. Their faces were remembered not because of beauty, but because of a striking wrongness, an eerie symmetry that felt unnatural. People avoided their gaze, speaking in hushed tones when they passed by. Children were warned not to go near their property. Still, they lived as husband and wife, walking through town as if daring the world to acknowledge them. The investigator uncovered diaries too, fragments of thought scrawled in handwriting that was uneven and trembling. They spoke of loneliness, of hunger, of shame so deep it seemed to bleed through the ink. One entry, barely legible, mentioned a phrase repeated again and again. Blood is all we have. Blood is all we are. That phrase lingered like a curse. It explained the silence of the neighbors, the careful distance kept by the community. It was not just the deformities or the rumors. It was the sense that this couple embodied a secret the town itself wanted to erase, because to admit they existed was to admit how far isolation, poverty, and neglect could twist the human story. And so, their existence was allowed, but never spoken of. They lived on the margins, fed by whispers, carrying the burden of being both proof and punishment. Proof of what happens when families are left to collapse in on themselves, punishment for sins that had started long before they were ever born. The house itself became a monument to their existence, though no one called it that. To outsiders, it was just another decaying structure on the edge of town. But for those who lived nearby, it was a place to avoid, a place that seemed to breathe with something unnatural. The shutters clung crookedly to their frames, the roof bowed inward, and the porch sagged like tired bones. The weeds grew higher than a man's waist, hiding the pathway that had once led to the front door. And yet, inside that house, the couple lived their lives as if the outside world no longer mattered. Neighbors remembered the strange sounds that carried through the woods at night. A low moan, sometimes laughter, sometimes something far less recognizable. Hunters who strayed too close swore they heard whispers carried on the wind, words that didn't sound quite right, syllables twisted in mouths that had never learned to form them correctly. Those hunters never returned at dusk. They'd rather risk walking in the dark than pass too near the house when night was falling. The investigators' notes describe a chilling discovery in the upstairs bedroom, a bed frame held together with wire, mattresses so thin they might as well have been blankets, and above it all, pinned to the wall with rusty nails, were more photographs of the two of them, smiling, holding each other, posing in ways that made clear they did not see themselves as brother and sister, or even as kin. To them, they were husband and wife. Their faces pressed together in forced portraits told a story of love twisted by circumstance. But love cannot erase blood. In the town's memory, what little of it people dared to admit, there were whispers of children, infants who never saw their first birthday. Some were said to be buried behind the house, marked only by stones too small to notice. Others were taken away by relatives who vanished soon after. But none of it was ever confirmed, but the silence around the subject spoke louder than words. People did not ask, and the couple never answered. The longer the investigator stayed in that house, the more he wrote of an oppressive feeling, as though the air itself was heavy with secrets. He described the smell of damp wood and iron, a smell that lingered on his clothes long after he left. And in his notes, one line stood out among all the rest. This is not just a house, this is a tomb for two people who were alive but never truly allowed to live. What made their story so haunting was not only who they were, but how they were remembered, or rather, how they were erased. The most inbred couple in America did not exist in history books or in census records that were often falsified or left blank. The town learned to treat them like shadows, present but never acknowledged. And yet, despite the silence, fragments of their lives seeped through the cracks. Elderly residents, when pressed, admitted to faint memories of seeing them walk together into town. Their clothes were always worn thin, patched over and over until the fabric barely held. The man's gait was heavy, his shoulders rounded forward as though the weight of his bloodline bent his spine. The woman often clutched his arm, not in affection, but in a desperate need for stability. Her face carried an expression that unsettled people, half vacant, half aware. She seemed caught between knowing the shame others saw in her and not understanding why. The investigator pieced together that they had been born into families that were already fractured by cycles of intermarriage. In places where opportunities were scarce, where a family's land was the only inheritance worth protecting, blood was often kept within the family to preserve it. Over decades, this practice warped not only faces but minds. What should have been rare became common, and what should have been unthinkable became accepted. By the time this couple reached adulthood, there was no one left for them but each other. It was this inevitability that struck the investigator hardest. Their story wasn't one of monstrous choices, but of no choices at all. They were the children of poverty, of neglect, of generations cut off from the wider world. They had been born into a script written long before they took their first breath. To blame them entirely would be to miss the larger truth that their love, as tool, twisted as it was, grew out of desperation, not desire. Yet, the town could not bear to face that truth. To admit their existence meant admitting complicity, so the couple became a living reminder of what everyone wished to forget. People crossed the street when they saw them, children were told stories that painted them as something less than human, and slowly the two of them retreated further into their crumbling house, leaving only whispers behind. The investigator wrote that it felt as though the town itself was haunted, not by ghosts, but by silence. A silence so deep it devoured memory, leaving behind only fragments. And perhaps that was the cruelest part of their story. They were alive, but treated as though they had already been buried. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed in that town, carrying the weight of whispers? Or would you have run, no matter the cost? The investigator admitted he struggled to sleep after his first visit. Something about the house clawed at his mind, pulling him back again and again. He returned with a recorder, hoping to capture what words could not describe. At first, it picked up only the creak of the floorboards, the hollow whistle of wind seeping through the broken windows. But in one recording, faintly, there was a sound, a low murmur, almost like a prayer. No words could be made out, just the rhythm of two voices speaking together, as though bound by a vow no one else could ever hear. The deeper he searched, the darker the discoveries became. Hidden beneath the floorboards of the bedroom, he found jars, small glass jars filled with objects that had once been alive. Locks of hair tied with ribbon, tiny teeth, too small to belong to an adult. Each jar carefully sealed, as if preserving not just memories, but proof of lives that had flickered and gone out. Whether these were tokens of children lost or rituals of remembrance, no one could ever say. But perhaps the most disturbing detail was a ledger kept in the man's handwriting. Line after line of names appeared, though many were repeated, the same surnames over and over, stretching back through generations. Cousins marrying cousins, sisters marrying brothers. Each entry seemed less like a family record and more like a confession. It was as though he understood what they had become, but could not escape from it. The investigator carried that ledger out of the house, his hands shaking as though he knew it contained something forbidden. Later, when he showed it to the few locals willing to look, I turned away immediately. Some grew angry, some began to weep, but all of them begged him to burn it. They wanted the past destroyed, not preserved. To keep it meant forcing the town to face a truth it had spent a lifetime burying. But the investigator did not burn it. He kept it, and in keeping it, he uncovered the one thing the town had spent generations trying to erase. Undeniable evidence that the most inbred couple in America were not an accident. They were the product of a cycle, one carried on deliberately, knowingly, for decades. The truth spread quietly, like smoke through cracks in the floor. The ledger and the photographs became artifacts of a hidden history that no one wanted to claim. And yet for the investigator, the evidence painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. The couple weren't just isolated figures on the edge of society. They were symbols of what happens when silence and shame take root, when a community chooses to look away instead of intervene. What haunted him most was how the couple seemed to carry no resentment toward the outside world. In every photograph, they clung to one another with a kind of fragile devotion. Their smiles, though crooked, were genuine. They lived in decay, in shadows, yet their connection seemed to be the only light they had. Was it love, or was it desperation disguised as love? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps in a world that had abandoned them, they became each other's only sanctuary. The town, however, did not see it that way. To them, the couple represented everything that needed to be forgotten. Parents frightened their children with warnings. If you wander too far, you'll end up like them. It was fear disguised as caution, shame turned into folklore. Over time, the couple's lives became less about who they were and more about what they symbolized. They were no longer people, but warnings. Warnings of what happens when poverty meets isolation, when desperation twists into inevitability. And yet, the investigator noted a disturbing detail in his journals. The couple never once tried to hide. They did not shutter their windows during the day, nor did they avoid being seen. They walked through town, heads bowed but unashamed, carrying their groceries, attending to what little business they had. It was almost as if they dared the world to confront them, dared the world to see what it had created. But no one ever did. Instead, people averted their eyes, allowing the silence to deepen. That silence is what gives their story its haunting power. Because it was not only the couple who lived in that house, it was an entire town's guilt sealed within its walls. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner, was a reminder of the truth no one wanted to face, that they had been seen but never helped, watched but never saved. The couple eventually disappeared from records altogether. No graves were marked, no obituaries published. It was as though the earth itself swallowed them, taking with it the last living trace of their bloodline. But the house remained, and within its walls, their story waited until someone was brave or foolish enough to uncover it again. By the time the investigator closed his notebook for the last time, he understood that he hadn't just uncovered a story. He had stumbled onto a wound in American history that was never meant to heal. The most inbred couple ever found in America were not simply victims of circumstance nor monsters to be whispered about. They were the product of a system that allowed entire families to vanish into isolation, hidden in plain sight, while the rest of the world looked away. And perhaps that is why their story endures even in fragments, because in their faces, in their fragile bond, in their quiet decay, we see a reflection of truths we'd rather ignore. The truth that poverty can cage entire bloodlines, that silence can be as cruel as violence, that shame, when left to fester, becomes its own kind of inheritance. The investigator's evidence, the photographs, the diaries, the ledger, still survives in whispers, though few dare to speak of it. Those who do often describe a feeling that is difficult to shake, as if once you learn of the couple, you cannot unlearn them. Their story clings to you like dust from an abandoned house, carried on your clothes, in your hair, refusing to wash away. Some say the house still stands, rotting deeper into the soil with every year. Others claim it finally collapsed under its own weight, burying the last of the couple's secrets with it. But even if the walls have fallen, their story remains, and it forces us to ask questions that have no easy answers. What happens when love is trapped within the boundaries of blood? What becomes of people when the world abandons them to their fate? And how many other stories like theirs are still hidden, waiting to be found? The most unsettling part is this. Their story is not as rare as we'd like to believe. Across forgotten corners of America, there are still houses, still families, still secrets buried under generations of silence. This couple may have been the most extreme, the most visible, but they were not alone. They were part of a pattern that history has tried again and again to bury, but never fully erased. And maybe that is why we tell their story now. Not to mock, not to sensationalize, but to remember, to face the truth that silence creates monsters, not the people themselves, but the shadows we force them to live in. And in that silence, we see the cost of forgetting. So the next time you drive down a forgotten road, past a house that seems too quiet, too empty, ask yourself, what stories were buried there, and who was left behind to carry them?